Michael has joined the subconference.
Hi, this is Wanda. If you need to reach me, Pam is out today, so you can reach me on 202-870-7818. Hello? The operator.
Hello?
Hello? Testing.
Yes, can you hear us?
Yes, this is Wanda, but we haven't started yet. But if you need to reach me, you can reach me on 202-870-7818. Miss Dunstan is out today.
Okay. And that's just for emergencies, I take it?
Yes, for emergency, sir.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. We also have Michael has joined the line as well.
Okay, yes, yes. Okay, thank you. But we're
You're
not
welcome.
ready to start just yet, okay? I'll call
Yeah.
you. Okay, thank you.
Hmm?
Hello, this is Wanda. The chairperson, Catherine Lehman, is here, and she will let you know when to get started, okay?
Yes, ma'am. Just let me know whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, this meeting of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights comes to order at 1:30 p.m. on March 22nd, 2019. The meeting takes place at the Commission's headquarters, located at 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20425. I'm Chair Catherine Lehman, and the commissioners who are present in addition to me are Vice Chair Timmons Goodson, Commissioner Narasaki, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Kursnow, Commissioner Cladney. I understand, Commissioner Yaki, that you are on the telephone. Can you confirm?
I am.
Thank you. Quorum of the commissioners is present. Is the court reporter present? I need a verbal yes for the court reporter. Thank you. Is the staff director present?
Present.
Thank you. The meeting now comes to order. I see that Commissioner Dagboulet is joining us as well. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for this business meeting?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I second.
Thank you. I'll begin the call for amendments with one of my own, adding a discussion and vote on the Wyoming State Advisory Committee Chair appointment. I also move to amend the agenda to place the voting items at the top of the agenda, as I understand that at least one commissioner will need to leave in order to catch a flight. Is there a second for my amendments?
Second.
Thank you. Are there any other amendments?
I have an amendment.
Commissioner Yaki?
Yes, I'd like to amend the agenda to include a vote on a draft statement that I circulated earlier this week from the Commission regarding the enforcement of hate crimes against white nationalism.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Are there any other amendments?
Don't need to add the line.
There are none. Let's vote to, oh, sorry.
Sure,
I think your microphone is off, Commissioner Kursnow.
yeah, I was just uncertain.
Do you want to turn your microphone on?
It appeared as if Commissioner Yaki's, at least according to the email I had, I thought Commissioner Yaki's statement was already included in the agenda. Is it not?
It's not. So,
Okay. No, then I would also move that my statement be included in the agenda.
terrific. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay.
Second.
Are there any other amendments? Hearing none, let's vote to approve the agenda as amended. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes unanimously. Our first item on the agenda today is the next iteration of the Commission's speaker series titled American Responses to the Rise of Nazism and the Refugee Crisis in the 1930s and 1940s. The Commission was privileged this morning to receive a tour at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, specifically of the exhibit titled Americans and the Holocaust. Special thanks to Stacy Burdett, who I see is here in our audience, for inviting us and for coordinating our visit. She is the museum's Government and External Relations Director. We very much appreciate it. We're grateful now to welcome back to the Commission Dr. Rebecca Erbelding, who has been an archivist, curator, and historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for 15 years. And we learned this morning she's been affiliated with the museum for 17 years. She holds a PhD in American history from George Mason University. Her first book, titled Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, was published by Doubleday in April 2018 and just won the 2018 National Jewish Book Award, JDC Herbert Katzke Award, for outstanding writing based on archival material. Congratulations. We heard from Dr. Erbelding 2 years ago regarding the MS St. Louis, and we are very glad to have her again with us today. So Dr. Erbelding, the floor is yours.
I want to start by thanking the commissioners for inviting me today and also for coming to the museum this morning to see the Americans in the Holocaust exhibit, which for anyone listening who did not come is available online for people who can't make it to Washington. The exhibit is part of a major new initiative to share new research on the United States during the Holocaust and to explore along with our visitors what Americans knew and what they did during the Nazi era. I'm a historian who works on these questions, and so my role this afternoon is to present information on the factors that played into American responses to the refugee crisis in the 1930s and the 1940s. The context of the period is crucial here. It's not meant as an excuse for inaction, and nor is it meant to provide a litany of reasons that we can cherry pick from for political purposes to argue why this period of history is similar or different from today. Instead, when we look at the US in the 1930s and 1940s, we realize that the past is not a foreign country. We can't look back and assume that all decisions were clear in the past, that it was an easy call, but that everything is just more complicated today. Decisions in the 1930s and 1940s, particularly about refugees, about national security, about economic insecurity, and about the roles and responsibilities of America and Americans, were difficult. Americans had fears and challenges, just as we do today, but this is a reality and should not become an excuse, just as it should today. Before I get into the particular details of the refugee crisis in the 1930s, I heard a quote recently that I'd like to share. In The Plot Against America, Philip Roth's novel about a dystopian America aligned with Nazi Germany, he wrote, "The relentless unforeseen is what we school children studied as history. Harmless history where everything unexpected in its own time is chronicled on the page as inevitable. The terror of the unforeseen is what the science of history hides, turning a disaster into an epic." We don't want to hide the terror of the unforeseen. We want to resurface it. We want to remind our visitors of it. Mainly, particularly when we look at the Holocaust, we have a tendency to read history backwards. We have images of concentration camps in our minds, and we skip too readily to the end of the story. But Americans back then don't have those images at hand. They've not seen them. The Holocaust has not happened yet. There is no word, genocide, and there won't be that word until 1944. It is unforeseen, and it will be terrible. But Americans are acting or choosing not to act without this knowledge. Until the 1920s, the United States was open to immigrants without numerical limits, so long as they were considered physically, mentally, and morally healthy and would not become a burden on the state. The exceptions, of course, were Chinese immigration, which was banned with few exceptions after 1882, and Japanese immigration, which the Japanese government promised to restrict in 1907 in order to avoid their own version of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The right to naturalize and become a citizen was still limited to free white persons of good character, and after the Civil War to African Americans. Asian immigrants could not become citizens until 1952. In the first 15 years of the 20th century, an average of about 900,000 persons immigrated to the United States each year. Some years it was over 1 million people. In fact, the US grew about 1% every year just through immigration. These are the immigrants we tend to picture, people who are arriving at Ellis Island, waving at the Statue of Liberty, going and presenting their paperwork in the hopes of qualifying for admission. In those first 15 years of the 20th century, 40 to 50% of those immigrants listed their racial category as either Polish, Italian, or Hebrew. But during World War I, immigration drops as it becomes more difficult to leave Europe. And then by the time the war is over, Congress becomes determined to limit immigration. There's a confluence of factors that lead to this change. First, the US becomes deeply isolationist after World War I. The Senate doesn't approve of President Wilson's plan to join the League of Nations, and throughout the 1920s, the US demilitarizes, vowing never to go to war again. And this results in anti-immigration sentiment because they felt as though the pressure of large numbers of foreign-born who had close ties overseas might pressure the US to intervene in future conflicts. There's the worldwide influenza pandemic in 1919, which led to 650,000 deaths in the United States. And Americans understand that disease as infiltrating the US from overseas. At the time, history books are focused on the closure of the American frontier and wrapped American history up in this idea that the country had been a place of opportunity for the many so long as we could expand. But now that the frontier was closed, that we had settled from sea to shining sea, those opportunities were going to be limited from now on. There are fears surrounding the Russian Revolution, and there are anarchist terrorist attacks and bombings in the US, in LA, on Wall Street, and there are red scares here, roundups and deportations of anarchists and labor activists, many of whom were Jewish or immigrants or both. And perhaps most crucially, the desire to limit immigration was based in eugenic pseudoscience. Social Darwinism, the idea that biologically some people are better than others, and that by cultivating good racial stock, America could retain its white Protestant so-called superior culture and avoid being soiled by immigrants. Eugenic researchers calculated that between 40 and 50% of all arriving immigrants were feeble-minded. Americans read mass market books like The Passing of the Great Race, which argued that there was a superior Nordic race responsible for all progress and that this race was in danger. Or, and this is another title, The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy, which is not meant to be demeaning. White supremacy was the ideal. It went through 14 printings in 3 years. Historians have noted that Hitler's Mein Kampf borrows directly from some of these texts. And the authors of these books and the organizers of eugenic societies began lobbying Congress for this change. Over the course of 1919, 8 unique bills are introduced in Congress, all proposing to suspend immigration to the United States totally for a period of between 2 and 10 years. In December 1920, the House passes a bill to end all immigration to the US for 1 year, aimed, and this is a quote, to provide for the protection of citizens of the US. That is why they would end immigration, to protect Americans. The vote is bipartisan. It is 293 for, 41 against. It is not close. The Senate was unwilling to take up that bill as written, but starts considering an amended version limiting immigration based on national origins. The idea of national origins is again based in eugenics. Eugenicists argued, and this is a quote, immigration is an insidious invasion, just as clearly as and works more certainly in national conquest than an invading army. The Nordic man, which in its purity, this is another quote, in its purity has an absolutely fair skin, was the ideal. Racial mixture, they argued, whether it was between black and white or so-called good or bad immigrants, would only result in the lowering of the offspring. The Ku Klux Klan, which boasted 2.5 million members in 1923, led a campaign against Catholics and Jews and foreigners, calling for a 100% American campaign. So these ideas are everywhere. In 1921, for the first time in US history, the US passes a quota law. The doors to the US remain open, but immigration is now limited. The opportunity available to immigrants is based on their country of birth, privileging so-called Nordic countries, while severely limiting visas available to Southern and Eastern Europeans, places where Jews and Catholics live. At the last minute, the Senate rejects a proposed amendment, which would have made a distinction between immigrants and refugees by exempting immigrants who could prove that they were escaping political or racial persecution from these quotas. Had this amendment been enacted in 1921, America's response to the refugee crisis in the 1930s might have been very different. For more than 2 years after the passage of this Emergency Quota Act of 1921, the quota is administered at the US border. It is chaos. Ships are racing across the Atlantic trying to deliver their passengers before the monthly quotas are filled on Ellis Island. Shipping companies start complaining to Congress because they are being fined if they deliver immigrants, and those immigrants, the quotas of those countries have already been filled. So to deal with this, Congressman Albert Johnson, who's the chair of the House Committee on Immigration and a member of the Klan, he had once written that he was in Congress to bring about, and this is a quote, a heavy reduction of immigration by any method possible. He proposes a new comprehensive bill, co-authored by Senator David Reed. Johnson is from Washington State, Reed is from Pennsylvania. The Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 becomes law on May 24th, 1924, and it remains US law with very few amendments until 1965. The quota system capped immigration from quota countries, basically all countries outside of the Western Hemisphere, at approximately 164,000 people per year. And then it divvied that number up by country. They did not use the word quota the way that we do today, as in a quota that you have to hit. Instead, the quota is the maximum number of immigrants that could enter, the upper limit, not the goal. Germany and Great Britain had the highest portion of the quota, since eugenicists saw those immigrants as reliably white and Protestant and easily assimilated into the US. In fact, 86% of the quota is reserved for immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, 12% for Southern and Eastern Europe, and 2% for elsewhere. Some countries had quotas of 100 people per year. The entirety of Africa had 1,100 quota visas available each year. The Johnson-Reed Act also codifies an Asiatic barred zone defined by longitude and latitude from which immigration was prohibited entirely. The law made exceptions for non-quota immigrants, meaning professors, clergy, rabbis, people born in the Western Hemisphere. Those groups were not numerically limited by the Johnson-Reed Act. And to solve the problem of the ships racing to Ellis Island, State Department consular officers were now responsible for approving the paperwork. So applicants had to wait in their countries to receive their visas. Although all of this happens in the 1920s, 15 years before the refugee crisis of European Jews, this is when the bulk of the American government's response to that future refugee crisis is decided. The seeds are sown long in advance of Nazism and not in response to it. The refugee crisis is the unforeseen. Immigration is limited. Those limits are rooted in racism and anti-Semitism. Prospective immigrants have to wait in their countries. It is a slow, deliberate process that is not designed to work in a crisis. And besides agreeing that people fleeing persecution could be exempted from a literacy test, there's no differentiation between immigrants and refugees. There's only one process. It will not change until after World War II. There are no new laws passed to let Jews in or keep Jews out in the 1930s, because the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 did that. Most of the US government's actions or inactions in the 1930s make sense, at least intellectually, when you know these things. For example, I spoke here a few years ago about the St. Louis, carrying 937 mostly German Jewish passengers. Most are on the waiting list for the US to obtain visas and are planning to wait in Cuba for their turn to come up to present their paperwork. When Cuba turned them away for having fraudulent landing permits, the US does not allow them to enter. We had no refugee or asylum policy, and the quota for Germany was filled that year already. Anti-immigrant sentiment was still strong, and although many Americans expressed sympathy for the refugees, there's no appetite to change the law or make any sort of exception for them. I just skipped ahead, so let's go back for a second. After 1924, when Johnson-Reed passes, the quotas are basically filled for a few years. The quota allocations are revised in 1929, and the immigration total is lowered from 164,000 total people to 153,000. 1929, though, is also the year of the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. And as has happened before and has happened since, economic instability exacerbates anti-immigration sentiment. Our unemployment problem was transferred to the United States from foreign lands, a Texas senator complained. And if we had refused admission to the 16,500,000 foreign-born in our midst, there would be no serious unemployment problem to harass us. President Herbert Hoover issues an instruction to the State Department to strictly enforce a public charge clause of an older immigration law, forcing an immigrant to prove that he or she would never need any sort of public assistance. Immigration drops from about 147,000 quota immigrants in 1929 to fewer than 13,000 in 1932. 1933, there are 8,220 immigrants that entered the United States. 20 years ago, it had been over 1 million. Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, and Roosevelt takes office a few months later in March. And as the front pages of American newspapers spread the word that Nazi Germany was boycotting Jewish businesses and banning and burning subversive books, 25% of the American workforce is unemployed. The Labor Department, which housed the INS, and the State Department, whose consular officers are responsible for issuing visas, get into a debate over whether exceptions can be made for German Jewish refugees, and ultimately nothing changes. Approximately 90,000 Germans sit on the US waiting list. This is the consistent length of the waiting list from 1931, before the Nazis take power, to 1937, mainly because German Jews who are escaping Nazi Germany are traveling locally, going to France or Belgium or the Netherlands to kind of wait the Nazis out, or because they know they can't qualify to come here. Between July 1933 and June 1944, the first full quota year that Hitler's in power, the US only issues about 4,000 visas to people born in Germany, out of the 25,957 visas that are actually available through the law. Sorry. Roosevelt adjusts the State Department's interpretation of this public charge clause in 1933 and again in 1937. And as more Germans join the waiting list to get here, the consulates slowly begin to issue more visas. It's clear by 1938 that life in Germany is becoming unbearable for Jews. In March, Germany annexes Austria, bringing another 200,000 Jews under the German control. Thousands wait outside US consulates every day to get on the waiting list for the US, and suicides skyrocket. President Roosevelt combines the German and Austrian quotas, but that still means that only 27,370 people can immigrate each year. Roosevelt also calls an international conference in Evian, France. 32 nations attend, most declaring in very polite diplomatic language that they are not willing to take any more immigrants, either for economic reasons or because, in the words of the Australian delegate, they do not have a racial problem and they're not interested in importing a racial problem. The Kristallnacht attacks in November 1938 are headline news in the US for 3 weeks, with font much larger than the coverage of the 1938 midterm elections or the 20th anniversary of the end of World War I. Polls show that Americans overwhelmingly, 94% of them, disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews, but only 21% think the United States should bring in more Jewish immigrants. Congress is bipartisan in their unwillingness to adjust the immigration laws. The situation is so bad that in April 1938, a group of Jewish congressmen get together amongst themselves and decide that none of them will introduce any new legislation to open immigration any further. That even having the debate will only lead to bills that will restrict immigration. And dozens of those bills are introduced in 1939, from bills to end quota immigration entirely, to bills to say that an immigrant's entire family has to be subjected to intelligence tests prior to receiving a visa. None of these bills pass, but the few bills that call for opening immigration, none of them do either. The members of Congress who favor immigration restriction echo public opinion. In January 1938, Americans are asked if they want their member of Congress to open the doors of the United States to more European refugees. Only 9% say yes. President Roosevelt is a politician. He is not a humanitarian. And although Eleanor consistently voices her support for Jewish refugees, he prioritizes recovery from the Great Depression and victory from World War II. At times, he acts in small ways to aid refugees. Normally, he does not. And it is becoming more and more difficult to physically leave Europe, not just because of the quota system and the massive demand on visas, but because in June 1940, the German waiting list is over 300,000 people. And after September 1st, 1939, when World War II begins, it becomes incredibly difficult to physically escape. For example, in October 1938, the month before Kristallnacht, 5,504 Jewish refugees immigrate from Europe to New York on 55 ships from 14 different European cities. 3 years later, in October 1941, the month that Nazi Germany forbids Jewish immigration from its territory, 3 ships, all from Lisbon, carrying only 100 passengers, are able to make the crossing. That was it. Once the war reaches an area, those ports shut down to US-bound transportation. September 1939, German ports and Polish ports close. The spring of 1940, ports in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Norway, in Denmark, in France, closed to US-bound transportation. Passenger ships are converted into troop ships. And by June 1940, refugees have to get to Lisbon if they want to find a ship that can take them to the United States. Even after World War II begins, most Americans are convinced that the country is going to be able to stay out. There's a robust national debate between groups like America First and the CDAAA, the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. And those debates happen over what America's role should be in the war and in the world. Once France falls in June 1940, many Americans believe the US could be dragged unwillingly into war. Spies and saboteurs, possibly disguised as Jewish refugees, could bring the country down. Roosevelt capitalizes on this fear in order to urge war preparedness. He says that Jewish refugees could be Trojan horses, their loved ones back in Germany held hostage in exchange for acts of spying and sabotage. The INS moves from the Department of Labor to the Department of Justice, as immigration officially goes from being a question of economics to a question of national security. Immigration is restricted even further, and within a year, US consulates in Nazi-occupied territory close. Immigrants no longer have a place to go to receive a visa. The doors to the United States never officially shut, and there is no last ship out of Nazi Europe. Instead, many doors are shut on immigrants all along the way, or had been bolted closed years before. There are many last ships, many almost made it, and hundreds of thousands, millions of tragic stories. We estimate that the United States accepted between 180 and 220,000 immigrants fleeing Nazism between 1933 and 1945. That is more than any other country in the world. But clearly, as I hope you've heard from my talk, that's not something we should pat ourselves on the back about. I quoted Philip Roth at the beginning with the idea that history is the relentless unforeseen. In the 1920s, the refugee crisis is the unforeseen. But with an immigration law based in eugenic science, racism, anti-Semitism, isolationism, economic insecurity, and fear, the American government's response to the refugee crisis that began 15 years later is not surprising. It's also important to remember that Nazi Germany murdered the Jews, not the United States. Our immigration laws were not generous, but America was not homicidal. The Nazis were, however, and they were relentless. And in the face of desperate human need, the United States did not bend. We did not relent either. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the sobering talk. Really appreciate it. And open for questions from my fellow commissioners. Madam Vice Chair.
Again, thank you so very much, Professor, for joining us. I don't know that I have a question. It's more of a comment. I visited many museums in my time, and the Holocaust Museum that many of us were fortunate to visit today was absolutely incredible. This morning you presented the context, the information, and then the action that was taken. I believe that we can look at, I took a lot from that. It's a way to look at life and certainly look at the issues that this nation is facing at this time. And I thank you for causing us to ask questions of ourselves, along with much of the information that you presented us. And I will forever take with me the fact that just because an issue, a problem is huge, often even appearing insurmountable, that one need not hesitate to try to do something about it, that small steps are certainly better than no steps at all. And anyway, I just think that is so profound, and I thank you very much for doing that for us. And Madam Chair, I thank you for planning and putting this before us.
Thank you.
Commissioner Harriet?
Thank you so much for that presentation, which sounded balanced to me. I mean, I'm not a scholar of that period, but it sounded very balanced to me. I'm also no scholar of the Bible, but I seem to remember that somewhere in there, there's a line about put not your trust in princes. So I thought it would be nice to mention some of the private citizens who did do things that were interesting. You know, Americans like Varian Fry,
Yes.
like Mary Jane Gould, who
Yes.
was like a brilliant character for a novel, I would think. A woman who was, you know, a very wealthy heiress, had spent all her life on frivolity, but when the Holocaust came, you know, she was there and she helped. And women like Marion Davenport,
Yes.
an art student in France, an
How do you know
American
this
again.
story?
And the other one I was trying to think of is Lois Gundon.
Lois Gundon, yes.
Yes. And so if you have any comment about the Americans who were heroes, I'd love to hear it.
Absolutely. So you pointed out 3 women, and it is Women's History Month. And one of the things that I pointed out to the commissioners this morning is that social work was a very gendered profession at the time, and a lot of the refugee aid organizations were headed by and run by women. And I think that's very important to note. Mary Jane Gould and Miriam Davenport were both crucial to the success of Varian Fry's operation in southern France. Varian Fry was a journalist who went in June 1940, well, he gets appointed in June 1940, he leaves in August 1940 to try to get 2,000 intellectuals, writers, artists, many of whom were Jewish, some were political opponents of the Nazis, out of France. He does so in spectacular fashion over the course of a year and a half, working with these women who were in France. Miriam Davenport, as an art student, was evaluating the artists to see the unknown names. Were they good enough to qualify for one of these limited visas? Lois Gundin is also amazing. She was a French teacher in Goshen, Indiana, and a Mennonite. And her community asks her to go overseas, go to France, southern France, and be in charge of a children's home. That there were children of Spanish Republicans whose families had lost the Civil War and had gone into France, and Jewish children whose parents were in internment camps. Would she go and head a children's home? And in October 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor, she goes across the ocean. There are very few ships, as I said, crossing west. She goes east. She goes into an area that is almost certainly going to be a war zone. And at one point tells the SS that they cannot come into the home. She has been named righteous among the nations. And in the fall of 1942, she's arrested and interned in Nazi Germany for over a year, along with American diplomats and the Quakers, who are also still doing relief work in southern France. She's amazing. And she goes back to the United States in 1944, and she keeps teaching high school French. Does not make a big deal about this. This is not, and I think that is one of the consistent things that you see in rescuers and you see in people who are making the effort to help, is that they don't think this is a big deal. They don't see any other way to do it. This is what you do. When people are in need, this is what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to let people know, if you haven't seen the exhibit, it's incredibly well done, very powerful, particularly linking in the voices of everyday Americans and where they stood on the issue. So thank you very much. I have to say it was actually a very tough exhibit for me because of the echoes of the internment of my parents. But I think very important for everyone to see. I did think that one of the things that struck me was near the end of the exhibit, there's the discussion of the kids who at the very end were allowed to come to the United States, but then held behind barbed wire, basically. So I would like to hear more about that story and how they got there and how they were finally released, because I feel like the commission is looking now at the detention and separation of families and their kids at our southern border. And when we saw the pictures, many of the commissioners all reacted the same way, which was very reminiscent to us of what's happening today.
So beginning in January 1944, the U.S. has a policy of rescue and relief. There is a War Refugee Board, which is a government agency tasked with trying to do this. And 2 months later, in March, the War Refugee Board writes a memo arguing that we should establish refugee camps here in the U.S., that we should bring Jews here to stay for the duration of the war. They can go back after the war, but they should be held in safety here. They argue that this should happen because we can't let the Nazis say that we never point out our hypocrisy of saying that we care so much about the Jews, but never offered to receive these people. It takes about 2 months to get the rest of the government to agree with them. They launch a propaganda campaign. They get friendly newspaper columnists to talk about how great it would be if we could have a refugee camp here. And finally, in June 1944, they convince Roosevelt to unilaterally announce that this is going to happen. They can only have the one camp and only bring about 1,000 people here. And they need to find an emergency to convince Roosevelt that this is necessary. They find an emergency. They realize that the U.S. military is actively turning away rickety wooden boats of refugees that are trying to make it from Yugoslavia to Allied occupied territory in Italy. They're turning them away because they're saying that these territories are full and that the Allied armies need to press on and they can't be taking care of people. And so they convinced Roosevelt to rescind that order, to say that no, the U.S. will take anybody who makes it from Yugoslavia to Italy, and also to relieve some of the pressure of the camps, we will bring 1,000 refugees from Italy, from Allied-occupied Italy, to the United States. More than 900 of the refugees are Jewish, and they represent 18 different nationalities. They are kept in Fort Ontario, which is an old War of 1812 fort on the banks of Lake Ontario. It has a long history and is actually under consideration now to become a national park, incorporating both the history of the fort in America's wars and the site of the only refugee camp in the U.S. Bureaucratically, it is run by the War Relocation Authority, the same agency that was running Japanese internment camps, and the staff are the same people. Bureaucratically, that was how it worked out. This is under the Department of Labor. So these refugees arrive in August 1944. They are kept at the camp until January 1946, when they're finally released. Since you can't change your immigration status in the US, they board buses, make it to Canada, register at the consulate in Niagara Falls, and then have to re-enter as legal immigrants. As I said, the kids are able to attend public school, but the parents cannot work outside the camp, and they cannot spend any time outside the camp. Even to visit relatives who may have immigrated sooner, or to see sons and daughters who are serving in the U.S. Armed Forces who had immigrated and joined up. Their parents are not allowed to leave the camp until 1946.
Yes, and I just wanted to note one other crossover, because you had talked about the religious groups who stood up, including the Quakers, and it was really, the Quakers were really one of the few who actually stood up for Japanese Americans who were interned and would visit the camp. So just a shout out to the Quakers.
Commissioner Yaki, I think you may not be on mute. If you could mute your phone, we'd appreciate it. Dr. Rebelding, I was really struck at the beginning of your talk when you said that the past is not a foreign country, and that frame is why we have a speaker series, to ask us to consider the lessons of the past and how they apply today. The extraordinary exhibit at the museum, I think, asks each visitor in each moment of the exhibit also to consider that frame also. So I appreciate the frame. Now, your work leading to this point, your presentation today, your exhibit, it was enormously painful to listen to, and also to then witness. And I just want to say thank you to you for that work, and for helping each of us to remember why we're here on the commission and why we do what we do in our time. So I'll thank you. I understand that Commissioner Yaki has a question now that he's on mute. Maybe he'll come off mute and come in and ask. Commissioner Yaki?
Am I unmuted by now?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry I didn't get a chance to see the exhibit today, but I hope I will in the future. It's something that obviously every American, every person I think who comes to Washington D.C. should go to. My question has more to do with how the past is prologue, and I just wanted to get your assessment, if you can give it, on the resurgence of anti-Semitism worldwide, and even in this country. As you know, that a cemetery was just vandalized a couple days ago in Massachusetts, including with Nazi symbology and words being scribbled on headstones. When you see this and you think about the role the Holocaust Museum plays, what are your thoughts as you see the world as it is right now, still having the seeds and the feelings that are out there that we thought we had extinguished over 50 years ago?
I would say that I don't necessarily think we had extinguished it 50 years ago. And I think the Holocaust Museum, my colleagues in particular, have always been aware that white supremacy and anti-Semitism has stayed part of our culture. Unfortunately, I think one of the things that you see is that when Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany, you don't see an uprise in German citizens protesting his anti-Semitism. You don't see them taking to the streets in defense of their Jewish neighbors. Few and far between does anyone stand up. And I think that reminds us that when we see acts of anti-Semitism and when we see white supremacy, this is something that we can do that can change that equation. Is we can stand up and we can do something about it. And our role, the museum's role, we feel is in education. So after Charlottesville, we put out a glossary of terms, of signs and symbols and hate speech to remind people that the symbols and signs that the marchers used in Charlottesville are not new, that these were people who were deeply immersed in Nazi ideology. And they are deploying it in the same propagandistic ways that the Nazis did. And we should be aware of that and aware of where this rhetoric is coming from and the hatred that was bound up in it from the beginning.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Duggan.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. One of the pieces of the exhibit this morning that I thought was interesting was the extent to which it explored a distance in time between what our government came to know about what was happening in Germany and across Europe and what the plans were, and when the American public came to have a broader understanding of the atrocities. I was wondering if you could comment on that and help us understand what the historical record has revealed on those points.
What we see is that all along Americans have information. In 1933, they know pretty accurate information about book burning, about boycotts of Jewish stores, about attacks on Jews in the streets of Germany. As long as there are diplomats and journalists in Nazi-occupied territory, Americans are getting this information in newspapers. And this is a time when, you know, there are foreign correspondents, multiple foreign correspondents. There are 75 at least foreign correspondents for different newspapers, different American newspapers who are in Berlin reporting live of what is happening. And so Americans can read it. Whether they consider this part of their concern is a different question, but they have this information. In July 1941, the consulates close. Reporters slowly begin to leave Nazi territory. And at Pearl Harbor, American journalists, the few who are still in Germany, are rounded up and interned and have to be prisoner exchanged out. December 1941 is also the date the first extermination camp opens. So the Holocaust really ramps up at the exact same time that American journalists are leaving foreign territory or being kicked out or being interned. So the first reports that are coming out about mass murder or a town being rounded up and shot are coming out second and third hand. They're coming out through the Soviets. They're coming out through the Polish government in exile, which is in Britain. And Americans are unsure about that. They're unsure whether this is just what happens in war. The enemy is always murdering women and children. That is how people get Americans to fight. How you get anybody to fight is you demonize the enemy. And so Americans think that they remember back to World War I and these atrocity rumors that they later thought were false. And they think that is possibly what is happening here too. So in 1942, the American government or the State Department gets word that this is a Nazi plan to murder all the Jews of Europe. That becomes public information in November. But largely Americans are either don't know what to do or are busy. They are going to work for the first time. They are trying to make up for the absence of husbands and fathers and sons who are off fighting. They're concerned about the war. So they may have information, but it does not translate, for most people, it does not translate to concerted effort on that front. It becomes, if anything, an extra determination to win the war, but not to rescue. Very few people, really no one, advocates diverting resources from the war towards humanitarian aid if it will prolong the war. No one is advocating prolonging the suffering of Allied soldiers or the fight of Allied soldiers in exchange for trying to rescue people. Nor does anyone have any concept of how that would happen anyway.
Commissioner Patton?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the morning and this afternoon. I found it excellent. Along the lines of Commissioner Degbole's question, this morning, and I got it wrong because I wasn't taking notes then, like I am now, diligently. You mentioned something about the press and the American public finding things out, and there was the exhibit with every thing. And we also had our ambassador in the 30s in Germany. And then you said something about facts become knowledge, becomes, and when did all that occur in a timeline, if you can? And I'm sorry, I don't remember all 3 or 4 of those subjects that you talked about, but I'm sure she'll be able to repeat them now.
Well, I mean, I think what I was talking about is you can read something and not internalize it. So you may have the information, but it doesn't mean you understand it. And then it doesn't mean you necessarily, at this time, believe it. And then it is the biggest jump, I think, is from knowledge and understanding and belief and translating that into some sort of productive action to deal with what you've read. To some extent, it's because we have short attention spans. And without knowledge of the future, we don't know where to look. Are we looking at Venezuela? Are we looking at Syria? Are we looking at Myanmar? Where is the next atrocity going to break out? The museum does a lot of work with early warning signs trying to predict that. But as an average consumer, it's hard to know. But that doesn't mean that we have the excuse not to act. And so that, I think, is the gaps that we need to jump. And in this history, the press reports things. As we went over at various points, the information is perceived by most Americans to be accurate or perhaps inaccurate or perhaps rumor. And people believe it and then take action at different points. And that is entirely based on the individual, who you are, what your community is doing and saying, and your personal belief and set of values. So some people are taking to the streets in 1933 and then don't pay attention again until 1945. Some are in 1938 trying to sponsor a refugee and going through extraordinary lengths. Some people are going to Europe. People are responding and making that leap between information and action at different points. For most Americans, they probably do not understand or believe the Holocaust until 1944, 1945. To many of them, they need to see it in order to understand what is happening.
And the government just chose to take a different path.
And the government, well, the government's not a monolith. So you could say the State Department the State Department clearly takes a different path from the Treasury Department. The State Department is all in, and the War Department is all in on this idea that we should just win the war as soon as possible to not divert resources. The Treasury Department is favoring a yes and approach, that we can win the war, but we can also administer humanitarian aid. We can also try to rescue people, and that won't divert resources from the war effort. The Treasury Department wins out in that debate in 1944. And that is why the U.S. has a rescue operation set up in January 1944 that saves tens of thousands of lives before the end of the war. Most of those people who are saved have no idea that the U.S. government is behind any of that work, but they are. And that moment in which U.S. and government response takes the turn, the moment when the Treasury Department starts to win the argument, is a really interesting moment in U.S. history, that they are successful in their argument that we can divert some resources, we can be, our actions can match our rhetoric about democratic values.
And was there ever and I apologize for asking too many questions again, what was the turning point that got Treasury to win? Well, how did they convince the powers to be?
There are a couple of things at play. There's a resolution in Congress calling for some sort of rescue response. There are activists advocating. There's even an Orthodox Rabbis March on Washington in October 1943 advocating for a rescue response. And then the Treasury Department lays out a case against the State Department, a case that they have been deliberately delaying humanitarian aid that could be going and helping people. They've been saying that we could do it and then delaying their approvals, and that they are deliberately keeping information about atrocities from the U.S. And so they argue that basically if we don't do something now, we might as well black out the Statue of Liberty, because we will be forever complicit in the murder of the Jews of Europe. And that's a very powerful thing as the Secretary of the Treasury, for him to hear and then to take to the president, that your legacy will be forever sullied if we don't do something.
Thank you.
To keep us moving, I understand that the staff director has a question, and then Commissioner Degbole. Commissioner Yaki, when you're not speaking, if you could mute your line, it will make it easier for all of us to hear here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us
As
again.
I said, it's not my line. I've been on mute since I last spoke.
Then someone else is making noise. Thank you, and I apologize for casting aspersions on your muteness.
I believe the noise is actually coming from Jeff. If you can mute your line, sir, when you're not speaking.
Mr. Staff Director, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Once again, thank you. Thank you for coming to speak to us for a second time here about lessons we can learn from the Holocaust. I was very lucky to have, as a professor, a hero of World War II, Jan Karski, and when I was an undergrad at Georgetown. And can you mention the role he played and how important that was, especially after the questions that the commissioners had a few moments ago?
Absolutely. So Jan Karski is a Polish resistance fighter. He is smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto to witness what is happening to Jews, and smuggled to a transit camp outside of the Belzec extermination camp. He is then smuggled out to London, where he talks to British government officials, and then to the United States with the help of the Polish government in exile. He meets with Roosevelt for about an hour in July 1943 to discuss what Karski is seeing in Poland. Not just what's happening to Jews, but what's happening in Poland. But Karski explains what he's seen in the Warsaw Ghetto. So within the span of a year, he goes from being in the ghetto to being in the Oval Office, explaining to Roosevelt what's happening. And at the end of their meeting, Karski asks Roosevelt, so what are we going to do about this? This is a 27-year-old Polish man in the Oval Office, probably intimidated, asking the president, the most powerful man in the world, what are we going to do? And Roosevelt says, we're going to win the war. That is consistent U.S. policy for this entire period, is we are going to win the war as soon as possible. That is how we will stop all the killing, not just the murder of Jews, but all the killing. And then finally, again, 6 months later, Roosevelt signs the executive order establishing a war refugee board and a dedicated rescue response. Roosevelt, because he doesn't live to see liberation, he doesn't live to write his memoirs, he doesn't live to reflect in a post-Holocaust world, we don't know what his motivations really are for establishing the War Refugee Board. We don't know why that change happens in him. And whether Jan Karski is in the back of his mind, whether he's remembering that meeting, it certainly had an effect on him, because he orders Karski to go see other government officials and to tell his story. So Roosevelt is at least clearly moved by what he's heard, even if he doesn't say that rescue is possible. Whether that's still in his mind 6 months later when he creates the War Refugee Board, it's hard to say. But it is certainly a pivotal moment and a pretty incredible moment to happen.
Commissioner Dagboy, want to bring us home?
Sure. One factual clarification. At that point, when there's the turning point between the Treasury Department and the Department of State, what's the best understanding of how many Jews have been killed in Europe?
Between 4.5 and 5 million have already been killed.
And picking up on the questions of my colleagues, are there other names, individuals who carried the debate forward for Treasury, who we should be aware of historically, the people that got in the trenches and said that the United States must do something else? Just share their names with us for the record.
John Paley, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury; Josiah Du Bois, Assistant to the General Counsel; Randolph Paul, the General Counsel at Treasury. These are major figures in this history. Yes, thanks.
Commissioner Krishna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You mentioned a lot of executive branch individuals who were involved in this. What, if any, individuals in Congress could you highlight as being advocates for greater refugee influx, doing anything? Were there factions in Congress? Because it strikes me that was notably absent from much of the discussion we had, and you would think that there might be more involvement from the legislative branch.
Sure. I talked earlier today about a bill for child refugees that is sponsored by Robert Wagner, a Democrat from New York, and Edith Norse Rogers, a Republican from Massachusetts. So that effort is a bipartisan one. Emmanuel Seller, a Democrat from Brooklyn, is a constant voice on behalf of refugees. Samuel Dickstein as well, also a New York Democrat. Constant voices. Emmanuel Seller is the Hart-Celler Act, which replaces the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, is Emmanuel Seller. 20 years after the Holocaust, finally repeals or overturns the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. That is a career for him spent advocating on behalf of more immigration to the U.S. There are a lot of the senators and congressmen who become involved in pushing Roosevelt for a rescue response tended to not be long-term senators, so they're not names that we know. But Will Rogers Jr. Was a Democrat in California, and I think he was a Democrat. I'm sorry. It's actually, you actually do have to remember which party people are from, because immigration and refugee matters are bipartisan. It is bipartisan for and bipartisan against both camps. It was not a party issue at the time. And so I believe he was a Democrat from California. He is in Congress for less than 5 years, but he really leads the charge in terms of pushing for a resolution calling on Roosevelt to do more to rescue.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I thank you and also the Holocaust Museum for hosting us today and for sharing your expertise with us now. We'll take a 10-minute recess and come back at 2:40 and look forward to that moment. Thanks.
Oh, okay.
I think I'll get, I can grab me some for Starbucks, just a plain coffee. Oh, so an iced coffee. Oh, sure.
My fans will be disappointed if I'm not in it.
Guy.
It's quite clear that what this man wants is not.
I'm going to reconvene us. We're a little bit early, but we are all here. So we'll reconvene now at 2:38 p.m. The next item is a discussion and vote on the discovery materials, namely the discovery plan, outline, and timeline for the commission project on sexual harassment in the federal workplace. To begin discussion, is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Degbolet, as the sponsor of this project, would you like to begin our discussion?
Absolutely. So first, a thank you to our colleagues in OCRE who have been working diligently to get all of our workflows on track, taking account of the shutdown and the complexities that added to our work across a number of projects. It has required some refocusing on when our meeting schedules are, what it will take to be prepared to have votes to advance the projects that are already in the queue, and some projects and briefings and hearings that lie ahead of us. This is one such project that required some recalibration. And so the core of the effort is to try and realign the schedule such that we can have the time to vote on the project line up with a regularly scheduled end of the year business meeting, which I believe may be moving around, but I think it's the first week in December is the notion, and after a lot of hard work and collaboration under Kathy's leadership, I think we have this proposed schedule that has been circulated to the commissioners, and I would ask, with thanks to OCRE and with the indulgence of our commissioners, that we reset the schedule consistent with what has been circulated.
Terrific, thank you. Continue discussion. I'll also offer a few points. The materials presented to us for vote today reflect research from the Office for Civil Rights Evaluation, as Commissioner Degbolet mentioned, as well as from Commissioner Degbolet himself. I thank both that office and the commissioner for that work. I believe these materials set this investigation with a solid foundation, and I look forward to the Commission's briefing in May 2019. Is there any other discussion of these materials? Hearing none, I'll call the question and take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degbolet, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
Sorry, I'm going to have to abstain on this one. I haven't had a chance to look at the materials.
Okay. Commissioner Kirsnow?
Yes.
Commissioner Cladney?
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki?
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki?
As long as I'm not accused of shuffling papers again, yes.
Thank you. Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote yes. The motion passes. One commissioner abstained, no commissioner opposed. All others were in favor. Our next item of business is the extension of stand your ground statement deadlines. To begin discussion, is there a motion?
I have a motion.
Go ahead, Commissioner Yaki.
Yes. And with the agreement of Commissioners Harriet and Personnel, I move to extend the deadline to the statement. Our statement is due on May 17th, 2019. Rebuttals are due on June 17th, 2019. Rebuttal notice is due on June 24th, 2019. And any rebuttal text will be due on July 1st, 2019. That is my motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Okay, I'll call the question and take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degble, how do you vote?
Abstain.
Commissioner Harriet?
Yes.
Commissioner Kursnow?
Yes.
Commissioner Cladney?
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki?
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki?
Aye.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote yes. The motion passes. One commissioner abstained, no commissioner opposed. All others were in favor. Now we'll turn to the next item on our agenda, which is a discussion and vote on the Wyoming State Advisory Committee Chair appointment. Before we begin discussion, I remind my fellow commissioners that the commission has a policy not to defame, degrade, or incriminate any person. Each of the individuals on our state advisory committees has agreed to volunteer time and energy in the pursuit and protection of civil rights. With that, I turn to our current appointment. The staff director has recommended for appointment Robert Byrd as chair of the Wyoming Advisory Committee. To open the floor for discussion, I move that we approve this appointment. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on this appointment? Hearing none, I'll call the question and take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degble, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
I pass.
Commissioner Kursnow?
Yes.
Commissioner Cladney?
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki?
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki?
Aye.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson?
Yes.
And I vote yes. The motion passes.
Wait, but I only passed.
Okay. Did you want
Yes.
to come back?
Yes.
Okay.
I was going to ask for that clarification, whether pass was consistent with abstain or something different. Now we know.
Okay, good to know. The motion passes unanimously.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We'll now consider the amended business items, beginning with the proposed statement from Commissioner Yaki. I'll first turn it over to Commissioner Yaki to read his proposed statement.
Yes. I have a statement which I will now read with omitting the footnotes, as is our tradition. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the title is the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights urges the U.S. Department of Justice and the Trump administration to increase hate crime enforcement to address white nationalism. And the text goes as follows. Paragraph, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights strongly urges the United States Department of Justice and the Trump administration to increase hate crimes enforcement responsive to white nationalism and the violence motivated by hate targeted at people of color, faith, and newcomers to our country. Paragraph, in the last few years, self-identified white nationalist extremists have sought out and killed people of faith in their houses of worship. The 2015 first bullet, the 2015 murders of 9 African-American parishioners at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, a predominantly African-American church. Second, the 2018 hate killings of 2 African-American men in Lexington, Kentucky, after failing first to enter a historically black church. Next is the 2018 killings of 11 members of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Prior to the killing, he expressed his hatred of Jews and migrants to America on various extremist websites. New paragraph. The mass murder of 50 worshippers of Islam at the mosques in Christchurch was allegedly committed by a person with similar animus and virulent anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant views. He allegedly posted live video feeds of his killing spree on social media. It reached across the globe, including and especially within the United States. Indeed, neo-Nazis based in our country were touting their enjoyment of the video and hailing the actions of the alleged shooter. Paragraph. White nationalism is not confined to the reign of terror and violence perpetuated by the Ku Klux Klan, but is an active presence that now spans cities, states, nations, continents, notions, aided and embedded by the digital and wireless age in which we live. Regrettably, its presence in the United States is an infectious virus and an active threat to liberty, equality, and basic human dignity that must be stopped and cured by the sunlight of transparency and the balm of leadership from all sectors of American society, political, business, religious, and our communities. Our hearts go out to the victims of Christchurch and the good people of New Zealand and to the victims of similar domestic violence and murder. And we also know we have a responsibility here at home to combat the forces that promote these violent attacks, because as we have seen time and again, this kind of hate knows no boundaries and no restrictions of geography. Last paragraph, to not act forcefully and forthrightly in moments such as this is a missed opportunity to say to white nationalist, extremist groups and individuals that their actions are intolerable in America. The United States Department of Justice has the tools and authority to respond effectively to hate and to lead the country in safeguarding our core civil rights commitments of equality for all. This commission urges DOJ and the Trump administration to use every tool available to lead our nation against hate.
Thank you, Commissioner Yaki. Is there a motion so we can open the floor for discussion?
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson.
So moved.
Hello.
I think Commissioner Yaki was moving.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
And Madam Vice Chair, did you want to open for discussion?
Yes, I did. I want to thank Commissioner Yaki for his leadership in this, and I guess I'm still so very moved by our presentation earlier this morning and this afternoon, and I've just been left with what the professor shared with us just a short while ago about the fact that how important it is that when you see something, you ought to stand up for it and do something about it. And I guess I just feel that this statement is that something that I can do by voting for it and adding my name to the list of those in support of it. And so, yes, I will be supporting this this statement.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Any other discussion?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I want to thank Commissioner Yaki for putting this together. I agree with the sentiments expressed herein. I'm probably going to abstain only because I'm going to prepare my own statement, which will express many of the same sentiments as contained in Commissioner Yaki's statement, said in a slightly different way.
Hearing that, do you want to ask to try to work on a statement that would be joint, or do you prefer to?
I think it's important to get a vote today as quickly as possible. Working on a statement would delay it. And I think this is a statement that should go out, and I'll have my own.
Okay. Any other discussion? Oh, Commissioner
I just want to say I've been working on that with Commissioner Kursanow. And again, obviously I agree with almost everything that's said, but I would put it in a somewhat different way. And I think that probably the best thing to do, unless, I would support you if you want to do otherwise, but it's probably better just to get it out.
Well, it's Commissioner Yaki's proposal. My own preference would be unanimity if it's possible, and it sounds like it is. So my own preference would be to try to come together, but this is Commissioner Yaki's statement. Commissioner Arasaki?
I very much appreciate the fact that you are working on a separate statement and supporting us moving forward with a statement to get something out quickly, because I actually agree that it's important for it to be timely, and my experience is it's been a little challenging for us to get agreement on language and tone, and that might delay it. So I very much actually appreciate your accommodation, and I would vote to try to move this.
I'll offer a Hail Mary that as the chair, I often speak for the commission, and I love it when I'm able to speak unanimously for us. And so if we are able to get to something that I could represent on behalf of the whole commission, we have just a few weeks until our next scheduled vote.
We can do both, can't we? We can get these statements out and then have something that, we all agree with the chairman when she says blah.
That sounds great. Okay. Any other discussion? Okay. I'll call the question and we can take a roll call vote. Commissioner Degbele, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet,
I abstain and will have a separate statement.
Commissioner Kursnow,
Abstain, ditto.
Commissioner Cladney,
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki,
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki,
Aye.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson,
Yes.
and I vote yes. The motion passes. 2 commissioners abstained, no one opposed, and all others were in favor. We'll next consider the amended business items, beginning with the proposed statement from Commissioner Kursnow. I'll turn it over to Commissioner Kursnow to read his proposed statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The statement reads as follows. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights condemns recent anti-Semitic statements made by Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. We also express our disappointment that the House of Representatives did not formally rebuke them. One of the first notable comments made by Congresswoman Tlaib in her new position was to accuse supporters of the anti-BDS, that's Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement or bill, of dual loyalty, tweeting, quote, "They forgot what country they represent," end quote. Congressman Omar has made a number of comments suggesting that Jewish Americans have divided loyalties between the United States and Israel. On February 10th, Congresswoman Omar engaged in a Twitter exchange in which she shared her belief that American support for Israel is due to campaign contributions from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, despite, quote, unequivocally apologizing, end quote. Less than 3 weeks later, Congresswoman Omar stated at a progressive town hall at which Congressman Tlaib was also in attendance, quote, "Nobody ever gets to have the broader debate of what is happening with Palestine. So for me, I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it's okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country." Congresswoman Nita Lowey responded to the comments by tweeting, quote, "Lawmakers must be able to debate without prejudice or bigotry. I'm saddened that Representative Omar continues to mischaracterize support for Israel," end quote. Congressman Omar responded, "I should not be expected to have allegiance/pledge support to a foreign country in order to serve my country in Congress or serve on a committee." Congressman Omar's suggestion of Jewish allegiances to a foreign power particularly troublesome because Jews disproportionately are targets of hate crimes. In New York City in 2018, 69 separate individuals were arrested for anti-Jewish hate crimes, which was the largest number of people arrested for any type of hate crime in that city. Nationally, 523 people were arrested for anti-Semitic offenses in 2017. Despite being repeatedly informed that questioning the loyalty of Jewish Americans because of their support for Israel is an old and harmful anti-Semitic slur, Congresswoman Omar continues to make such statements. This suggests that she actually believes what she says, that American support for Israel is driven by Jewish Americans' prioritization of Israel's interests. The slur, one of the oldest and most pernicious in history, has no place in public life.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Commissioner Kursnow. Is there any discussion? Oh, sorry, is there a motion so we can begin discussion?
I move that the Commission adopt the statement as read.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I second, yeah.
Okay. And now I'll open for discussion. Go ahead, Madam Vice Chair.
Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Kursnow, for bringing up the issue of condemning religious intolerance. I don't think any of us on the commission endorse that kind of thing. I have to confess, though, that I'm concerned about personalizing the condemnation so very strongly. I'd be willing to see if we can't work something out that gets to the strength of the condemnation, yet not personalizing quite so much.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I'll note, as I have said, I welcome unanimity among us when we can get to it, and I strongly agree that the Commission should continue to speak against religious intolerance. I asked my special assistant to reach out to Commissioner Kursnow's special assistant to see if we could find common ground to work on a statement that we could all sign on to, and I would welcome doing that if we could. And as I've noted, there is another business meeting in just a few weeks. I would be delighted to work on some edits and see if we could come up with text that I could vote for a statement against religious intolerance. Any further discussion?
I would just like to say that I really haven't had enough time to go over the statement. I've read it once, and I haven't kept up with this issue with the Congress person. So I will be abstaining if there's a vote.
Madam Chair, since we've been acting with such comedy, I'm glad to postpone this for a couple of weeks.
Thank you. I would really welcome the opportunity to work with you on it, so I appreciate it. Thank you, Commissioner Curso. Okay. Now we will turn to presentations from our state advisory committees. First, we'll hear from our Connecticut Advisory Committee Chair, David McGuire, on the committee's advisory memorandum titled Solitary Confinement in Connecticut. Chair McGuire, the floor is yours.
Hi, Dave. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
So I was hoping to update you all on our briefing on solitary confinement and then tell you a bit about an upcoming briefing that we're holding on April 2nd. So if you recall, back in February of 2017, we had a briefing at the Capitol here in Connecticut on solitary confinement. We had 3 panels and a really robust open comment period. And ultimately, we were able to very quickly turn around some recommendations for the legislature in May that ultimately did fuel some legislation that passed the next month in June. And that law, if you recall, was one that banned the use of solitary confinement on children, anyone under the age of 18, and then also implemented some pretty strict reporting requirements and necessitated a report that the commissioner would put out in the beginning of 2019. So that he had, almost a year and a half to write that report. And I've just gotten that report, and it is a really great document that details all the progress that they've made since the law passed in 2017. One of the things I just wanted to highlight was prior to the law passing, there were anywhere around 150 to 250 people in solitary confinement at any given time in Connecticut. And right now there's 29 people in solitary confinement. That's out of a population of about 13,000. So there's been a very, very steep reduction in the use of solitary confinement. And I really do attribute a lot of that to the SAC's work and the Hawthorne effect, meaning that the reporting requirements have really moderated the behavior there. There are still some concerning disparities in terms of the race of folks that are held in solitary confinement, but that's a much larger criminal justice issue here in Connecticut that I'll get into in just a moment, because I think we have to address that in different ways as a commission. The other thing, just to note really briefly, is that if you recall, the project our SAC did before the solitary confinement was one on racial profiling. And I actually was not a SAC member at that time, but was an observer and saw how effective the SAC was in advocating for really detailed data reporting on traffic stops. And Connecticut really does lead the country on that now. California, a couple of years back, modeled their statewide racial profiling law off Connecticut's. Based on the Connecticut work, we now are able to drill down to officer level analysis, meaning before we were looking at it as a state, and now departments, and we've gotten to the point where we're looking at individual officers. And, similar to the great work we did on solitary, there are now fewer reported cases of racial profiling, and the overall trend has gone down. It's still something that needs to be worked on, but those two briefings that the SAC held make me believe that the briefing we're going to hold on April 2nd is going to be very, very impactful. And that's a briefing that will look at racial disparities and prosecutorial practices here in Connecticut. As I've alluded to, with the still alarming racial disparities in the use of solitary, we know that about 65% of our prison population are folks that are Black or brown. And that is almost 3 times what the state population is. So there is, something at the front end of our system that needs to be addressed. And we're hoping that through our briefing on the 2nd, we'll be able to advise the commission about some of those potential sources, some of those decision points where the racial disparities show up, and makes potentially some recommendations about increasing transparency and oversight. We're one of 3 states in the country that appoint our prosecutors, and they're appointed by a body of 6 people who the governor appoints. And it's essentially a rubber stamp. There's not any meaningful oversight or scrutiny there. I'm excited that we have 2 really great panels. The first is one that will have criminal justice players in Connecticut give a baseline. So we'll have 2 people from the state's attorney's office. That's what we call prosecutors in Connecticut. We'll have a public defender, and then we'll have someone who is the undersecretary of criminal justice and policy planning. That person just came to Connecticut from the Council on State Governments and has a really, really good viewpoint of where Connecticut fits into the national picture. And then our second panel is going to look to folks outside of Connecticut to, first of all, weigh in on what they heard on the first panel, and then talk about their efforts to combat racial disparities in their system. So we'll have someone from Larry Krasner's office in Philadelphia, the head of their Conviction Integrity Unit. We'll have someone from University of Pennsylvania School of Law's Fair Administration and Justice Center. We'll have someone from the Fair and Just Prosecution organization. They're relatively new, but they're doing a lot with data transparency and trying to come up with some better data-driven decision-making in law enforcement, which will lead to hopefully less racial disparities and better public safety outcomes. And we'll have someone from the Brooklyn DA's office who's also doing some work around these racial disparities. So I'm really excited about the panel that we have, and I think similar to what we did on solitary confinement, we have the real chance to help move some legislation that will hopefully set in course a chain reaction that will identify and reduce racial disparities here in Connecticut. And it's very much tied to the 2 other projects we've recently done. So that's my main presentation. I'm happy to take any questions on any 3 of those projects I briefly touched on, and I appreciate the commission's support.
Thanks very much. I'll open for questions from my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Narasaki.
I really want to thank your committee for an incredible report. It echoed many of the themes that in a hearing we just held on women in prison around the issues around solitary confinement. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to work some of your findings into that report. I was struck by a couple of things. One was the discussion about what are the options, alternatives for solitary confinement. And you quoted that only recently have systems like Pennsylvania and Rikers developed model programs that can be used as alternatives. And I'm wondering what alternatives there are that you are thinking about.
Well, here in Connecticut, we went from that 250 number down to 29 by really emphasizing officer wellness and training. We're as a correction system, we're a unified system. So all of our prisons and jails are run by one governor-appointed commissioner. And that creates some opportunity to really have system-wide change quickly. So they've really put an emphasis on bringing in mental health experts to help officers better identify who really needs mental health care and needs to be de-escalated in a different way. And we're certainly not perfect here, and we have some real medical and mental health care problems in our system. But since the report came out, it really has been a kind of reflection point, and we've seen different programs at different facilities. So there's not a one-size-fits-all, but they're really putting an emphasis on the mental health care. And you're seeing that people, the reporting that we get now monthly will tell by facility how many people are in solitary and how long they've been in there. And the really positive piece from the reporting has shown that fewer people are put in it, and they're in for a much shorter period of time. And that is, I think, largely due to the mental health de-escalation that they're using. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful. And then I had one other question that also echoed the hearing that we just had, which is how realistic the ability is for prisoners to be able to file grievances about how they're being disciplined. And you have in points 10, you talk about the disciplinary tickets, and that if a prisoner complains and challenges, then instead of getting a week in solitary, they'll get a month or more. And the second is how the grievance system actually is not seen to actually work, that the prisoners aren't really heard and actions are not taken. So I'm wondering what recommendations you guys were looking at in terms of how those issues get addressed, because we heard that as well in our other hearing.
Yeah, that is a huge issue. And I used to practice in this area, and I would often find that prisoners were unable to file the grievances, and that they were not responded to in a meaningful way. And like you just mentioned, oftentimes resulted in retaliation. We as a state are actually piloting now, and I think some of what we brought up in that briefing may have sparked this, an electronic system where prisoners will have a tablet, and they're made for the facilities, and they're safe, and they're clear, so they can't be used to hide contraband. But those tablets will be used for a number of things, including legal research, but also the grievance process, so that there is essentially an electronic paper trail of who filed what. It'll be used for medical and mental health requests as well. And it will be a system that can't be as easily manipulated or overused or misused by prisoners. So it's to everyone's benefit. So I would be happy to chase down some information about how that pilot is going, and through Barbara get that to you, because I think it is a kind of exciting way to address what is a very real problem in a lot of facilities.
That does sound very interesting, and it would be really exciting if you could share that with us. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Chair McGuire, this is Catherine Lehman. I will say to you again here what I have said to your State Advisory Committee separately, which is that I was really wowed when I first started at the Commission to see, as an early work product in my tenure, the first memorandum from the Connecticut State Advisory Committee about the solitary confinement issue that was timely and helped to move state legislative action in a way that responded to the concerns that your advisory committee raised. And that was an inspiration for me, and just incredibly exciting to see as something that our state advisory committees can do. I have been delighted in the 2 years since to see several other state advisory committees likewise following suit in taking timely and effective action to make progress in their states responsive to the concerns that the committees address. And I very much appreciate seeing the ongoing commitment from your committee to this issue, and to continuing to see it through past even your initial recommendations as an advisory committee. So I thank you now, and I hope you will share with your fellow committee members that thanks for the effectiveness of your work and the tenacity of your work.
Thank you for the support, and I will definitely share those comments with them.
Thank you. Any other questions from fellow commissioners? Hearing none.
I would just like to make a statement. I'd like to thank your committee as well, because I think solitary confinement is a very important issue, and it has been overused in this country by a long shot, as you can see by the numbers that occurred in your state. So thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
And with that, Chair McGuire, we thank you for your presentation, and and also for your leadership on your State Advisory Committee. And we'll next hear from our Tennessee Advisory Committee Chair, Diane Diani, on the committee's report titled "The Civil Rights Implications of Tennessee's Civil Asset Forfeiture Laws and Practices." Chair Diani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. Our report on CAF was unanimously adopted in about a little over a year ago in February 2018. I know that you have the report, so I'm just going to touch on a few highlights and then do my best to answer any questions you have. Our single overarching finding is that Tennessee falls well short of the enacting legislation goals of having a law enforcement tool both consistent with due process of law and protective of innocent owners' property interests. We found that it does neither, that Tennessee is one of the least protective of the states in terms of owners' rights, and its policies and practices raise significant civil rights concerns regarding fair and equitable administration. The timing of our report was should be noted. We submitted our proposal in February of 2017 after extensive media coverage in Tennessee of numerous high-profile instances of abusive seizures on Tennessee's interstate highways. So there was a lot of state interest. In July, 6 months later, we had an in-person all-day public hearing with enthusiastic participation of 23 panelists, generating a near 400-page transcript. Not only did we have academics and advocates, I think it was important that we had 6 legislators, 4 senior law enforcement officials, and 4 lawyers who practiced and represented clients in forfeiture proceedings. So there was some real deep knowledge and many points of view that really led to a very robust discussion. We had several written submissions as well, and a few months after our hearing, the U.S. DOJ's IG issued a report critical of, they did an audit of Tennessee's DOS on equitable sharing, and it was a critical report finding that Tennessee had no accounting or oversight of equitable sharing funds, and that funds were being misused for unauthorized items such as banquet tickets and catering and so forth. So we had a substantial record with which to write this report. I'm just going to highlight a few of our specific findings that are detailed in the report. Tennessee is only one of 3 states that requires a property owner to post a cash bond to just even begin the process of challenging the legality of the seizure. And if there's, you have to post a bond for each reason of seizure, so you might have to post more than one. And remarkably, you have to post a cash bond even if the property taken is cash itself. Many panelists talked about how that defies logic for the owner to have to post a bond when it's the state that's holding the property. We also found that there are substantial due process concerns with a lack of independent, neutral to hear forfeiture cases, because our hearings are all conducted through one state agency, the Department of Safety, and DOS employees are both the prosecuting attorneys in a forfeiture, as well as the ALJs, which hear the cases. And if you want to do an administrative appeal of an ALJ's decision on forfeiture, the administrative appeal goes to the ALJ's boss. This concern of lack of independent neutral is exacerbated by limited judicial oversight, the fact that Tennessee uses the second lowest standard of proof, which is the preponderance of evidence. There's no right to legal counsel or fee shifting, even where basic needs such as transportation and shelter are at risk. And in Tennessee, innocent owners are required to prospectively assign waiver language, waiving Eighth Amendment protections of excessive fees and cruel and unusual punishment for any future criminal prosecution on the settlement form. We also found a lack of accountability, too little accountability, as our local LEAs retain 100% of the forfeited assets, which they can use without any oversight. It creates a perverse financial interest. We had some very ample testimony here. One elected DA testified that he knew officers were specifically directed to go out and do seizures to fund their own salaries, trips to conferences, trips to CLEs, and continuing education and so forth. And he said flat out that individuals are being subjected to forfeiture procedures that would not otherwise be if CAS was not, his words, a cash cow. There's a lack of sufficient data collected, and although our General Assembly a few years ago started requiring some reporting information, it's all very general statewide aggregates, and we found it too limited to be useful. There's no data on how, when, where, and from whom seizures are occurring, and no demographic and geographic data. the real concern with low value seizures, particularly when a seizure of $140 or a watch, iPhone, or gift card from people who might not have who might be innocent and not have the ability or wherewithal to post that cash bond, get and file the required legal forms. There's a very strict timeline for the owners to file the forms without hiring an attorney, and we had testimony that legal fees for these type of cases run $4,000 to $7,000 or more. All of this, we also found that many of our panelists spoke about serious concerns about disparate impact of forfeiture of low-income individuals, communities of color, and other marginalized communities. Several spoke of the impact of low-income, low-asset families who might have a family car, and if it's seized because of one member, the family can't get to their jobs. Even if they ultimately prevail, it can take 10 or 11 months to get the property returned from the state, and at that time, people can lose their jobs and fall into an inability to sustain even basic needs of food and shelter. A police lieutenant testified that traffic stops with respect to racial disparities. A police lieutenant had testified that traffic stops created, quote, opportunities for seizures. And we also later in the hearing had an attorney involved in a very large driving while black study that was done here in Nashville a few years before, that empirically showed enormous discrepancies in the percentage of traffic stops for black and white drivers in Nashville. We had an attorney tell us about there are several attorneys who actually, again, did this work, and there were some very compelling individual stories of their clients facing forfeiture proceedings and how it went. And one of the attorneys mentioned a client that was a young black man who was pulled over and happened to have $1,200 in cash with him. And although no drugs were found and there was no other suspicious activity of any sort, they took his money anyway because 10 years earlier he had had a misdemeanor marijuana charge. We also had an immigration attorney talk about the disproportionately high seizures against the immigrant community, and he attributed to a variety of vulnerabilities due to language barriers, likelihood of carrying cash, and so forth. Relatedly, there are many who spoke of the CAF's deleterious effect on police-community relations, the erosion of trust and authority of the police. And one of the panelists said, it was very concerning, said, some members of our community are more concerned about being robbed by police than by a stranger. Our recommendations, our report calls for substantial statewide reform. We've divided it into near-term, intermediate, and long-term because we have so many thoughts about reform. We've spelled it out in detail in the report, which you can look at. I'll just summarize that generally they fall into one of four categories: promoting due process, such as eliminating that bond and other things; protecting innocent owners by reducing procedural barriers and fair treatment across communities with mandatory training and so forth; reducing the perverse financial incentive. We have several recommendations that speak to that. I'll point out only an important one of eliminating CAF when the seized value is under $100,000, and then finally transparency, improving transparency and accountability through data collection and so forth. I'm happy to stop here and take any questions, or I'm happy to speak more about some developments in Tennessee since our hearing.
Thank you so much, Chair Diani. I'll open for questions from fellow commissioners. I'll start by just thanking you for your very thorough and comprehensive report. It's a pleasure to read and to see the depth of information that you took in, and also the very thoughtful findings and recommendations that follow from your report. I was also pleased to see that your presenters included some presenters that we've seen, and in particular Vikrant Reddy, who has testified to us on related issues in the commission, and whose testimony I found enormously helpful. So it was a pleasure to see the thoughtful and genuinely bipartisan nature of the information that you took in, and to get to review.
Madam Chair, sorry to interrupt. Could we just ask everybody that's on the telephone to mute while we are talking? We're getting crosstalk that is making it difficult to hear.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Commissioner Arasaki?
Yes, thank you. I echo the chair's comment. This is a really excellent report. I was very struck by a lot of the testimony that was summarized, particularly District Attorney General Crump's testimony that out of 101 seizures, 5 individuals were never even charged. He was testifying in that it was only 5, but that means 1 in 20. And I would think that for those 5, that was a pretty devastating seizure in any event, and they were innocent. It seemed to me like the issues are pretty shocking to the conscious in any regard. And then when you add Mothershead testimony about the racial disparities, that they found that virtually every one of the 50 patrol zones, that there was a racial disparity, and it didn't matter if the zone was high crime, low crime, or mid crime, and that in 90% of the searches, nothing was turned up, and 9% it was some kind of drug, usually marijuana. So I'm wondering what more has been done around the racial disparity aspect of what is happening there, and whether you've gotten any traction.
Chair Diani, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
You hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, we are continuing on in related areas. We are currently actually in the middle. We have next week a full day hearing on legal financial obligations. And with the CAF report, we've certainly done our best to get it out. There is, in Nashville proper, there have been lots of developments in terms of racial disparities that our SAC has not been directly involved with. But we're pleased that the Metro Nashville government just passed a resolution earlier this month. To support reform of CAF in Tennessee, and expressed in their unanimous resolution, they expressly mentioned our SAC and our report and our findings. One of our quoted from the report as to the concern with fair and equitable administration of justice. So we were very pleased to see that so our report so prominently highlighted by the Metro National government. We are also very interested in pursuing, because there's been some reform in the interim between when we adopted our report in early 2018 and when the report issued. There was a legislative session, and there were a few additional small reforms, some additional data to be collected, and the legislature also allowed for some fee shifting with capped attorney's fees. So that was, both of those things had been issues and concerns addressed in the hearing. So we were pleased to see those changes. And this year, we are also pleased to see that there is some movement actually on many of the issues that we've identified in our recommendations. It's actually very dynamic because it's happening right now. We've been trying to follow the bills and the amendments this very week. We think that there were many we were very excited about, like amendments to currently to bills that would do great things like eliminate the 350 bond, operationalize the Supreme Court's Timms v. Indiana holding by allowing for a process to challenge the constitutional disproportionality of the seizure, eliminating, which I think would be very, very important, eliminating small value seizures, not allowing for seizures with currency of less than $1,000 or vehicles less than $2,000, changing the standard to clear and convincing and so forth. So a lot of important potential amendments. I think this is a real opportunity. I think that Timms v. Indiana certainly brought CAF back into the consciousness of everyone, and we as a SAC are interested in taking the opportunity to perhaps do LTEs or something on this. Just this week, we heard that some of these items are going to go to summer study, so it's not clear that these will move forward this legislative session. We have citizen legislators, so we have a very short January to April legislative session. It's a 2-year session, so these bills will then be back up next year. So we now have the opportunity to think about how we as a SAC push some of these reforms forward, particularly in advance of next session.
Commissioner Osaki.
That is extremely gratifying, and congratulations to your committee on the impact that you're having. The other thing that struck me was Samuel Lester's testimony about how homeless are treated and how even their possessions and their cash are being confiscated, and that even if they don't have a hearing, their money, any ready cash they have, are taken ostensibly for the, quote, cost of their jail. A lot of that, I'm sure, are issues that are not just happening in your state, and I'm wondering if there's been any special action taken on that, any discussions with police about how they might be acting differently.
A bit, but we are actually, that may well be an issue that we look at. We're going to be looking at in our hearing as we go forward with legal financial obligations. That idea that, with his testimony about the taking of things from homeless folks, even if they're released, that they've lost their stuff. Try to fold that discussion as we look at our hearing next week with individuals that will focus on some of the impacts of this for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? And thank you very much, Chair Diani, for your service and for your leadership on the Tennessee State Advisory Committee and for taking the time to speak with us today. And next we'll hear from our Oregon Advisory Committee Chair, Thompson Fowler, on their committee's report titled Human Trafficking in Oregon. Chair Fowler, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. As you know, the Oregon Advisory Committee submitted a report on human trafficking in Oregon and its impact on communities that are targeted because of their race, color, age, sex, religion, national origin, and disability. This question came up in Oregon because in recent years, the state has emerged into the spotlight, national spotlight, as a destination for human trafficking. This is due to several factors. First of all, the Oregon State Constitution has a very broad free expression clause which permits a thriving sex industry in Portland. For example, the Portland metropolitan area became known as a hub for sex trafficking, ranking secondly only to the greatest number of children found in forced protection among all states. We followed Las Vegas in that regard, and that's revealed through a national federal law enforcement sting. Also, since its inception in 2007, the National Human Trafficking Hotline has received 1,970 calls that led to 450 cases on human trafficking in the state of Oregon. Oregon has come to the spotlight because of its geography that includes large swaths of rural agriculture and forestry areas that provide opportunity for labor trafficking of foreign-born workers. And a third point is that Oregon's proximity to shipping waterways and to the Canadian border provides access for international traffickers. While Oregon has made several efforts to address this problem of human trafficking, state and local anecdotes indicate that the trafficking of persons does continue. The committee focused its study of human trafficking on the following industries: sex, agriculture, and forestry. Initially, we intended to just concentrate on the sex industry, but as we got into further discussions and held our various public meetings, the agriculture and forestry were added to our consideration. The committee also examined the effectiveness of state and local agency programs administered to victims of human trafficking. Findings in the report are based primarily on the testimonies that I referred to that were heard during 4 public meetings, and included, and there's a list of human trafficking in the form of gender-based discrimination, commercial sexual exploitation of children disproportionately that affects certain demographics. Several foreign-born communities are disproportionately affected by human trafficking. That includes victims from Mexico, Central America, and Southeast Asia. There is a lack of culturally specific and gender-appropriate services to assist human trafficking victims. Another point is, despite service providers noting emergency shelter as the greatest need, there are few options in Oregon for human trafficking victims. Another point is that data collection on human trafficking related activities is limited. We found that the H-2A and H-2B visa programs are problematic and characterized by rampant exploitation of foreign-born workers. Also, we found that proactive enforcement of state labor laws is needed to support prosecution of human trafficking cases. Government agencies also were found responsible for investigating and prosecuting potential human trafficking cases. That needs further effective methods of communication. There's also a need for training on how to identify victims and address human trafficking. Public awareness is also critical to ensure that the general public is aware of the prevalence of human trafficking in the state. And finally, the victims of trafficking should be treated as victims instead of criminals. We elaborated in our report on each of these, and so I would call to the attention of the commissioners to those elaborations. Human trafficking in most cases often refers to sex trafficking. In Oregon, victims of sex trafficking are largely female and are forced into sexual exploitation, although there is indication that transgender individuals and males are also affected. There's also an indication that other protected classes are impacted by sex trafficking, such as the Native American community and foreign-born individuals. The labor trafficking, as I said, did come up, and it also affects a large, significant number of victims across several industries in Oregon, specifically domestic work, agricultural, hospitality, restaurants, and construction. In Oregon, the forest industry also has emerged as a problem with regard to human trafficking, as workers are largely recruited through international labor agencies. The majority come from Mexico, and workers from Southeast Asia are most likely to be war refugees from Vietnam. In keeping with its responsibilities and in consideration of the testimony that we heard on this topic, the Oregon Advisory Committee submitted 15 different recommendations to the Commission. Most of those are actually directed at the federal level, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Labor, and so forth. Those 15 are well delineated in the report, and I would call the attention to the commissioners if you haven't already that you have not already had the opportunity to read our report. But basically, those are the areas that we're tremendously concerned about. Other actions are being taken both locally, especially in the Portland metropolitan area. Through the police bureau and through the mayor's office, we have some various task forces that have been addressing the issue, and certainly at the state level and even the county level, further action is being taken to address these problems in the state of Oregon and in our metropolitan area. certainly welcome any questions or comments from the commissioners, please.
Chair Fowler, thank you for that very thoughtful presentation and for the comprehensive and thoughtful report that your committee prepared. I'll open for questions from my fellow commissioners. And I'll start while people are thinking. Number one, I enjoy your counting with the 15 recommendations, each of which has several subparts. I love your lawyerliness to the commission. And I was struck at the beginning of the report and then in your recommendations by the reference to Oregon having enacted about 25 new laws in the last 12 years related to human trafficking. And I wondered, A, why are those laws not sufficient? Why do the many gaps that you identify in the report remain? And then in your recommendations that include as a subpart of the 12th recommendation that the state legislature continue passing legislation that combats human trafficking, what specifically your state advisory committee believes is needed following the passage of these 25 new laws?
Well, basically, of course, there's been, shall I say, challenges to the issue and for the different entities that are addressing the problem of funding, of course, and everyone can identify with that. Basically, in my conversation as chair with the heads of the various task forces in here, there seems to be a lack of direction from again, some of the agencies, the federal agencies that I noted in coming to grips with the problem. And then also, it is, as I mentioned, a diverse problem here. For instance, we were fortunate to have a number of the members of the committee of our local committee, the SAC, who were involved in the labor industry with regard to agricultural. A number of them were from the Hispanic community and are very aware of what the problem was there. And so it's been, I think, a factor that somehow or another, the breadth of the problem has caused us to have a diverse interest and focus in that regard. So more and more, as I say, they're trying to look to address these different problems with with legislation that is appropriate.
Thank you, Chair Fowler.
Certainly.
Any other questions? Commissioner Arasaki?
Thank you for your report and the hard work of your committee. We had just, in December, issued a report, hopefully that you've had a chance to look at, on Native Americans. And I was struck by the jurisdictional issues that your report raises. And because we saw that very much being raised by Indian country, the cross-jurisdictional restrictions on their jurisdiction, and then the cross-jurisdictional sharing with the state and local governments, and how that has led to huge gaps where there are significant disappearances of Indian women and girls from reservations at a striking rate that Congress actually just recently had a hearing on. So I was wondering if you were getting much traction on having raised that issue and where you think that might go.
Excuse me, would you repeat your question? I'm terribly sorry. The very last part, I heard your statement.
Yes.
Specific question, please.
So you had made recommendations about the need to address some of the jurisdictional issues as they pertain to Native American reservations and the state and federal. So I'm wondering whether you've been able to get any traction on the recommendations you've made and what follow-up you're thinking about.
To speak very bluntly, there's been not as much traction there as I will speak for myself, and I'm sure maybe the community as well, as we would hope. There's any number of problems that have arisen and at least come to our attention as relates to especially some of the the number of Native American tribes that we have in the state of Oregon. They are, and again, there is diverse, and it feeds into the problem of human trafficking. For instance, the absenteeism in the school system, which is an issue we also addressed as a state advisory committee several years ago. And the fact is that the Native American tribes do have their own jurisdictional areas, and sometimes it's difficult to permeate that and to get agreement as to how we would deal with the particular issues. Nevertheless, of course, that doesn't stop us and should not. So we're trying to see where areas that we can make progress in that regard, and some of the various task forces that have been set up by the state and various counties and even cities have been addressing this particular issue as well. So we're hopeful that by continuing to look at the problem, we would be able to find some solution to the rather large problem that we do have here in the state.
Yeah, we are encouraged that I think there's some states, I think one of them was Minnesota, that is looking at sharing jurisdiction and trying to address those gaps that are created because of the current system. So I look forward to hearing what kind of progress you make. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Fowler, thank you very much for your presentation to us and for your service and leadership on your State Advisory Committee. With that, we will.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
With that, we'll hear next. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm cutting you off, and I understand there's a question. Okay, we'll move forward. With that, we'll hear next from Staff Director Mauro Morales for the monthly Staff Director's report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have nothing further to add than what's already contained in the report. I'm more than willing and available to speak to any commissioner about a particular matter they may have or a question they may have in the report. In the interest of brevity, I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Staff Director. And if there's nothing further, oh, there is. Commissioner Dagbile.
I just wanted to take a point of personal privilege to recall that an important civil rights fighter passed away 7 years ago today, the great John Payton, who was a colleague of mine and spent a good portion of his life engaging in civil rights fights, died as the only director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to die while he was serving. And John, who was a great man, a great advocate, and a mentor who created extraordinary opportunities both through his mentorship and through his litigation for generations of Americans, passed away 7 years ago today. And so hat tip to the great John Payton.
Thank you for that memory. Commissioner Arasaki.
So I want to thank you for that recognition of John Payton. He was certainly a mentor of mine. But also just want to recognize staff for the incredible work that you've been able to pull together despite the month-long shutdown that we faced. The hearing that we had and then the meetings today were incredibly productive, and I know that you really had to work hard to make up for that gap that was caused. So just, I just wanted to share my appreciation and the fact that we know that you're working, and we hope that you see the kind of impact that your work is having. So thank you.
I can speak on behalf of the staff. Thank you so much. It means a lot to everybody. Thank you.
And with that, I now adjourn the meeting at 3:44 Eastern Time. Thanks all.